Hey, it's a blessing to be here, isn't it? And I'm thankful every Sunday that I can get up and come and talk to you about Jesus. And I can't think of a greater privilege. We're going to do our confession together. Let's plan to do that. If I can get this thing, let me turn this on, Mark. It always works better when it's on. I found that's true of a lot of devices. We found out that dishwashers don't work if they're disconnected. Do you know that? They do not work. That's true whether they're flesh and blood dishwashers or whether they're mechanical dishwashers. Found that out too. Buddy, you get the old-fashioned dishwasher and get disconnected, it ain't going to happen. Let's do our confession together. Isn't it great to be alive and be Christians? I am a child of God, saved by grace. I live each day by faith. I'm ready to hear God's word. Stand, please. Let's hear God's word. This is a little bit lengthy, but bear with me. This is from Genesis 13, 1 to 18. 13th chapter of Genesis, in a lesson we're going to look at this morning called Good Choice, Bad Choice. And here's the story as the writer of Genesis tells us. He says, so Abram left Egypt. Let me remind you that in these early chapters of Genesis of the story of Abraham, his name is not yet Abraham, it's Abram. Hasn't got his name changed by God yet. So Abram left Egypt and traveled north into the Negev along with his wife and Lot and all that they owned. Abram was very rich in livestock, silver, and gold. From the Negev they continued traveling by stages upward toward Bethel. They pitched their tents between Bethel and Ai, where they had camped before. This was the same place where Abram had built the altar, and there he worshiped the Lord again. Lot, who was traveling with Abram, had also become very wealthy with flocks and sheep and goats and herds of cattle and many tents. But the land could not support both Abram and Lot with all their flocks and herds living so close together. So disputes broke out between the herdsmen of Abram and Lot. At that time, Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land. Finally, Abram said to Lot, let's not allow this conflict to come between us or our herdsmen. After all, we're close relatives. The whole countryside's open to you. Take your choice of any section of the land you want, and we will separate. If you want the land to the left, I'll take the land to the right. If you prefer the land on the right, I'll go to the left. So Lot took a long look at the fertile plains of the Jordan Valley in the direction of Zoar, and the whole area was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord and the beautiful land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot chose for himself the whole Jordan Valley to the east of them. He went there with his flocks and servants and parted company with his uncle Abram. So Abram settled in the land of Canaan, and Lot moved his tents to a place near Sodom and settled among the cities of the plain. But the people of this area were extremely wicked and constantly sinned against the Lord. Well, after Lot had gone, the Lord said to Abram, look as far as you can see in every direction, north and south, east and west. I'm giving all this land as far as you can see to you and your descendants as a permanent possession. And I will give you so many descendants that like the dust of the earth you cannot be counted. Go and walk through the land in every direction, for I am giving it to you. So Abram moved his camp to Hebron and settled near the oak grove belonging to Mamre. And there he built another altar to the Lord. May God bless this reading as we study it together, and his people said, amen, and have a seat. We'll try not to do any more standing. I don't want us to be like the national national prayer service yesterday. They about killed those poor people standing and sitting. I've never heard so many prayers in my life, man. I mean, everybody and his pet horse got up and said a prayer yesterday. That's all right, though. I'll tell you, running this country, whatever approach you have to running this country, you need everybody's prayers. So please keep that in mind as you plan your prayer time. Hey, we're looking at a series called Father Abraham. We're studying the life of Abraham and the lessons that can can come into our lives by looking at this remarkable man. Remarkable man, but also man. We noticed last week in our lesson that Abraham isn't always the righteous, holy, godly man that we think him to be. He's very flawed, very human. God works with that in our lives. He made mistakes. This one almost cost the entire plan of God. In fact, we noticed last week that in order to straighten up the mess that Abraham had created, God had to intervene directly in order to clean it up. The consequence is that after Abram had discredited himself in Egypt with the Pharaoh basically booted him out. He became persona non grata. And so he had to pack up his family and all his possessions and his nephew Lot and all his possessions and get out of the country. And so I get the impression that Pharaoh lined them all up, and he got his officials to kind of form a line, and they walked Abram and Lot and their families. They kind of escorted them to the border and said, see ya. And they stood there to make sure they didn't come back. And so Abraham has now been disgraced. Abraham has sought to live against the will of God. He left the promised land, which God told him to stay in. He left the altar he'd built. He left the worship of God. He chose worldly alternatives. He's now discredited himself and is returning home kind of with his tail between his legs. He's a wealthy man, but he has found out very quickly that wealth doesn't buy you a whole lot in some circumstances. And so, that's kind of where we find ourselves as we come to our story today. And as we set our stage, I'd like you to think about a couple of things. We all know this, but we don't think about it enough. Our entire journey through life is all about choices. I mean, from the time we're very small, we begin making choices. We continue to make choices. We make choices every day. I made the choice of what I was going to wear this morning. I made the choice of when I was going to get up. I made the choice of whether I was going to come to service or not. I'll make other choices. We're going to have to decide where we go to lunch. This is the big crisis in our family every Sunday. Where are we going to eat? And the ladies will always say the same thing. You decide. I've decided the last 39 times. Pick a place. Well, wherever you want to go is fine. No. You don't understand. Yeah, that's fine. Just wherever you want to go. So I picked the most disgusting place that I know they both hate, and then they'll say, well, we don't want to go there. Well, now, wait a minute. You just told me to pick where we're going to go. Now I pick it, and you say, we don't want to go there. Well, can't win. Can't win. You just turn around and let them kick you again, But life, seriously, is a matter of choices. And we all understand that. And we've all there are times, most of us, we've made some pretty good choices in life, haven't we? I've made some great choices in life. Have you made any bad ones? Oh, man, I've got some of those barkers in my history, too. Some of those kind that are just like, oh, boy, I sure don't know what I was thinking when I did that. And then you realize, oh, I wasn't thinking. See, here's the problem. The same thing about choices is you can't evaluate them except backwards. Only in hindsight do you really have the ability to evaluate whether your choice was a good one or not, because it's the outcome that determines whether the choice was good. And that's the flaw in the system. That's the frustrating thing about the system, is that, you make a dumb choice that you thought was great at the time, and then 5 years later you look back and it's like, man, that was awful. I should never have gone into that line of work. I should never have taken that job. I should never have hung out with that person. I should never have tried that little pill. We all live with the consequences of our choices, whether we like it or not. What I'd like us to think about this morning is, I think there are ways that you can minimize the collateral damage on the front end. Sometimes choices with God's help can be guided in a way that they don't have to become fatal. They don't have to unravel our lives later on. And so many times I know in my life, choices that have been bad choices, I've looked back, and those were choices I made without consulting God. God and I weren't on the same page with that one. In fact, sometimes, and you've done the same thing, I've made choices that I knew God didn't like, thinking that, well, I could make that work anyway. And, you know, the reason God didn't like it was because it was never designed to work. And by the time I see the result, it's like, oh my, now how do we get this fixed? And all you can do is what Abraham does. You got to go back home. You got to go back home, and you got to start over again sometimes. And so that's what I want us to think about. See, every choice we make moves us in either a positive or negative direction. That's true of every choice. Every choice you make moves you up or down. Moves you in a good direction or a bad direction. The goal is to get as many good directions as you can. And again, I think God can help us in that process. Abraham messed up his life in Egypt when he quit listening to God. When he left his altar and he left the land of promise where God said he'd be with him, and he went to Egypt and he adopted the thinking and the philosophy of that culture, and he decided to do things the best way he could with his own wits, and he was a smart man. He wasn't dumb, but he tried to hammer it out the best he could, and all he did was make a fiasco out of the whole thing. And so, like I said, now he comes home with his tail between his legs, kind of humiliated. His integrity has been besmirched. Not a very good-looking guy right now. He's got a bad rep. He's coming back to this foreign land that, by the way, he still hasn't settled in. It's still a new place to him. And now he's got to start all over. But I want you to notice that the guy starts making some good choices. Some positive choices. We're told that it says Abram left Egypt and traveled north into the Negev. The Negev is the desert region in the south of modern-day Israel. If you know where the Gaza Strip is, the Gaza Strip is the west end of the Negev. It's a very barren area. It's a very desolate place. But you can't get to the good stuff to the north until you go through the bad stuff in the south. So he comes up, takes the normal route that you would take. You go up through Gaza, and then you cross over through Hebron and up through Bethlehem and into the area around Jerusalem and on up north. And so he and his family are kind of moving northward back into the central part of the country between Bethel and Ai, two cities that would play some important roles in Joshua's invasion of the land hundreds of years later. But Bethel and Ai are right in the center of the land, just north, about 15 miles north of Jerusalem, a little bit to the west. Beautiful valley up in there. And Abram had built an altar there. When he first entered the land of promise, the first place he stopped to camp was Bethel Ai. And there, between those two cities, he built an altar to God. And it says earlier in the text that he first worshiped the Lord in Canaan at this site. So he gradually works his way back home to the only place he's really familiar with one exception. He is a different person in another way as well. He's filthy rich. He's got gold, he's got silver, he's got flocks and herds. This guy is loaded to the hilt. He is by his standards in that day and time, he's a multimillionaire. He's a big fish in the pond. And so is Lot. Lot has prospered as well. Now, Lot always attaches his wagon to Abram. Lot's not a very independent thinker. Lot attaches his wagon to Abram. But everywhere Abram goes, Lot goes, and every time Abram's blessed, Lot's blessed too. The funny thing is, we're going to see in a minute, when Lot finally goes on his own, guess what happens? Kind of like the prodigal son. It just all falls apart on him. So they get back to the land of promise, and three very significant things happen. Number one, Abram chooses to return to the promised land he should never have left in the first place. There is no place in this passage in Genesis that suggests that God ever told Abram to leave the promised land. That was Abram's decision. In fact, God had settled him in the land and said, "This is the land I'm giving to you. Settle here. Take the land. It's yours. Thank you very much." famine came to the land, times got tough, rather than trusting God to take care of him like God said he would, Abram says, we need to go to Egypt where they got more food. See, that's just like us, isn't it? You know, we're real tuned into God until we have to make a hard decision or things get a little bit lean. And then all of a sudden, well, maybe I need to go out on my own. You know, evidently the Lord's too busy to take care of me. The Lord never quit taking care of Abram. That was proved in Egypt. But he goes to Egypt on his own. Well, now he comes back to where God told him to go in the first place. The second thing that happens is he returns to his original place of worship. He comes home to God. Do you know what this implies? I want you to think about this. I looked at this carefully. There's no suggestion. It says Abram built an altar at Bethel and Ai. He went down to Hebron for a while. He built an altar there. Never in the Bible does it say that he built an altar to the Lord while he was in Egypt. So guess what happened? Guess what he quit doing? In our language today, he quit going to church. He quit going to church. He forsook the Lord. The altar's where you go for cleansing. The altar's where you go for fellowship. The altar's where you go to renew your communion with God. Guess what he didn't do in Egypt the whole time? No wonder he made a mess out of it. He and God were at odds with each other. And he knew it. So when he comes home, the first thing he does once he enters the land of promise is he makes a beeline right straight up the central highway to the place where he knew that first altar had been built. He had to go back and pick up where he left off. That's what you got to do when you mess up. Sooner or later, like Abram, you got to go back to your old altar. You got to go back like the prodigal son. You got to go home to daddy. You got to remember where the old homestead is. And you got to get back there as quick as you can, and so he did. The other thing that he chose to do, and I think this is remarkable, Abraham was never intended to be a landowner. He was never intended to live in a manor or a large estate. He was never picked by God to live in a city. God chose Abraham to be a wanderer. The Bible in the book of Hebrews mentions that Abraham lived his whole life in tents. He certainly had the means to live in something more than a tent. He could have sold off one small flock and probably built a really nice house with air conditioning and indoor plumbing and a swimming pool in the backyard. But that wasn't God's plan for him. Hey, listen, God doesn't always plan for us to drive luxury cars and live in the big house on the hill. God's choice in your life, God may want you to live in tents. And that's okay, because Peter, Paul, the writer of Hebrews, John, New Testament writers remind us again and again and again, we're just passing through. There's nothing permanent, not in this life. Anybody knows that. They took some windows out of the end of our house last week. So big plate glass windows. One of them, I knew something was wrong when I looked up and one of the windows was sitting like this. And there was a 1-inch gap at the top. And I said, that ain't supposed to be that way. And I brought the repairman over and he looked up at it and he says, that ain't supposed to be that way. And when he got down to the bottom of it, weather over 25 years had dry rotted the whole area underneath, including the second floor support beam across the whole end of the house, which you could pull out in chunks with your hands. So I said, I think we better fix that. You know? So we spent a lot of time repairing a lot of damage in order to get it back to the way it should be. Life sometimes is like that. Nothing is permanent. You know? You put something in, you think this is great. Now I don't have to worry about this for the next 100 years. He said, now this ought to last a while. And I said, well, if you can get me about 30 years, I'll be okay with it. But life's that way, isn't it? You buy a brand new house, and within 3 months, what are you doing? Remodeling. Why'd you buy it? If you didn't like it. But we do that, don't we? Nothing's permanent. So what Abraham did was he returned to his wandering lifestyle. He went back to his tents. He started moving from place to place. That's what you do when you have herds. In the summer, you graze in the lowlands. In the winter, you go, or in the summer, you graze in the higher elevations. You move around. You have to go to where the grass is. So that's what they did. Now, there's a little interlude in our story. Verses 5 to 9, there's a little interlude, little middle section there, where a problem, of course there's another problem. And guess what? It's a family problem. Shocking, isn't it? Abraham and Lot get along really well. They really do. They're very close to each other. And there's no suggestion in the Bible that God ever objected to Abraham bringing Lot along with him. But understand that Lot is simply hanging out with Abram. That's what he's doing. Like I said, he's hitched his wagon to Father Abraham. And wherever Abram goes, Lot goes. Well, God has decided that the time has come for this to end. Abram was given the land of promise, not Abram and Lot. And so at some point, you've got to fix that. And as so many things in your life and mine, if we won't fix it, God will fix it for us. He'll simply take care of it, and then you're saying, well, I don't understand. Well, I do. And someday you will too. Sometimes God just has to put his boot in your backside and give you a little push out the door. Or in the door, as the case may be. And that's what happens here. Lot had made his faith dependent on Abram. He became a little mini-me. He'd follow Abram around. He'd worship what Abram worshiped. He'd go where Abram went. He'd do what Abram did. He raised what Abram raised. He whatever Abram did, Lot did it. Now, the problem with doing this with your faith is when you attach your faith to somebody else and become dependent on them for your faith, you don't make good choices when you have to make your own decisions because you aren't quite sure what you really believe or how you understand God's will in your life. And if that person all of a sudden is not there to say, well, this is what you ought to do and this is how you ought to do it, and this is, yeah, it's great to have godly advice, isn't it? One of the greatest blessings in the world in making more of those decisions, positive than negative, is having good godly people around you who can guide you in advice. It's a great thing. But at some point you've got to find your own faith so that when God throws you out in the desert by yourself, you can still make those choices. When the devil comes to you like he did to Jesus on the Mount of Temptation, and Jesus is all alone for 40 days and nights, you can still pull that Word of God out and stick him with it. Got to have that faith of your own, and that's very important. We need to challenge our young people. Find your own faith, and I'm glad to see so many of them have. That's great. But that needs to continue throughout your life. Here's the problem. What causes more problems than anything else in families? Money. Material prosperity. These guys got fat and rich, and they had so many herds and flocks that there wasn't enough room for it. They both can't live in one valley. There's simply not enough forage in that valley to accommodate two vast farming enterprises. It just doesn't work. And so they started having fights, probably over pasture areas, no doubt over what few water wells were in the area. These are the things people fight over in that part of the world, water and graze. And so you got the conflicts going on. Notice it never says between Abraham and Lot. It says the conflict was between their herdsmen. But word gets back. Abraham's not dumb. He sees what's going on. Abraham's a good guy. At heart, he's a good, decent man. And so, being a man of integrity, Abraham gives Lot the choice. That's pretty generous. As the elder statesman, Abraham has the right to say, okay, since I'm your uncle and I'm older than you and you depend on me for everything, I'm going to pick this area. You can have that. Take it or leave it. And by the way, if you don't like it and won't leave, I'll drive you off if I have to. Abraham proves in the next chapter he can do that if he needs to. And he does it with somebody a lot more powerful than Lot. So Abram can, by right, take charge and choose the best land, or whatever land he chooses, whatever he wishes. But he gives a choice to Lot. It's kind of like the father and the prodigal son. Prodigal son says, give me my inheritance. First of all, you don't do that before daddy dies. That is presumptuous to say the least. Daddy could have just slapped him through the back wall of the house, and it would have been perfectly acceptable, and everybody would have said, yeah, you had that coming, you little smart aleck. But instead, what does daddy do? He gives him his inheritance. He says, sure, go ahead. Sometimes God will do that. You ask God for 100 foot of rope, he'll give you 100 foot of rope. He knows exactly what you're going to do with it. He kind of smiles and gives it to you anyway. Here you go. Run. Run, Forrest, run. You know, just let you go with it. And he'll give you just enough that the only difference is he won't leave you hanging. He'll pull you back if you'll let him. So, he allows this to happen. Abraham he says, listen, look over the land, you tell me what you want. Now we have a second choice. Abraham's made his choice, by the way. He's come home. He's come back to God. He's come back to the lifestyle God has chosen for him. He's comfortable in his own skin. He knows where he is. He knows where his relationship with God is. He doesn't have to prove anything to anybody. So he lets Lot make the choice. Here's what Lot does. Yeah, he makes a bad choice, doesn't he? He makes several bad choices. By the way, it takes years for these choices to play out. It cost him his wife. It cost him his daughters. It cost him his integrity. It basically ruins his life. Completely ruins Lot's life. All because of where he chose to live. I mean, it's that simple. You know? Lot looks over the land. He goes out and surveys a little bit, some of the higher hills in the southern part of the land. You can kind of look around. And he looks down toward the Jordan Valley. Now, the Jordan Valley it's beautiful. It's just a big strip. It's a big ribbon of green in a very brown part of the world. That part of the world is very parched, very dry, very little rainfall, mostly deserted desert areas. And right in the middle of it's this beautiful green strip called the Jordan Valley. And it starts up north of the Sea of Galilee, and it comes down through the Sea of Galilee and then on down about 35 miles south and empties into he should have learned from this, empties into the Dead Sea. Yeah, there's your message. He wasn't an expert in water quality. He wasn't an expert in geological formations. All he knew was he saw a lot of green grass and some big fancy cities where he could socialize and have people around him. And it looked to him like a pretty choice cut of meat. So Lot sits there a little bit, and Abraham, notice what Abraham says. He says, hey, you choose whatever you want. You want to go east, I'll go west. You go west, I'll go east. I don't care. I'll go wherever you don't. Lot looks down there, and he kind of looks back and grins to himself, and he looks back at Abram, and he says, I think I'll go east. Abram never bats an eye. He just says, okay, that's fine. God bless you. Go down there and prosper. Now, I want you to notice a couple of things that the writer of Genesis tells us. He gives us a little heads up to where this thing is headed. It says in verse 10, he saw the fertile plains of the Jordan in the direction of Zoar. Zoar is the small pocket valley where Sodom and Gomorrah sat. The whole area was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord and the beautiful land of Egypt. In other words, from an eye point of view, it looked pretty nice. Notice, parenthesis, this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. The writer's telling us this is not going to go well. Lot chose for himself the Jordan Valley to the east. He went there with his flocks. Abram settled in Canaan. Lot moved his tents to a place near Sodom and settled in the cities of the plain. Guess what he did? Number one, the thing that motivated Lot was pleasure and wealth. He looked at the cities and he saw comfort, something permanent, something secure, trade, maybe some of the fine goods that he'd learned to enjoy in Egypt. They'd come through those trade cities. He'd have access to them. green pastures, plenty of water. What herdsman wouldn't want that? So he looked at it and he says, hey, pleasure, wealth, prosperity, this is it. This is it. It's like everybody in the South leaving in the 1960s to go to Detroit and build cars. Everybody's family moved up north because they're going to get rich. Are any of them rich? No, they all worked up there 30 years, got their retirement, came home broke, right? That's the way it works. So he really thought he'd made a good choice here. He chose from a worldly standpoint all the things you'd look for. The other problem was he chose to associate himself with evil men, and the Bible suggests that people knew even then that those folks down in the valley were not very nice people. They already had the reputation of being vile, immoral, worldly people. Make no mistake, Lot and Abram had been around the land long enough. They knew that. They had to know that. You know, you can come to a new place and you don't have to be there very long, and you kind of know what neighborhoods to stay out of and what neighborhoods you can go into. You know, you go out and visit folks in L.A. and they'll just tell you up front, now listen, y'all don't need to be going over in South Central. You know, Normandy, just stay off that road, okay? You don't need to be on that road. That's not a good road to be on. Hollywood Boulevard, I know all the tourist sites are up there. You really don't want to take your kids up to Hollywood Boulevard. They're going to see things you don't want your kids to see. It doesn't take long to size up a location, know where to go, where not to go. Lot knew what he was moving in with. But you know, like so many of us, he thought to himself, hey, I can sit down next to these guys. I won't get dirty. I can hang out with these folks. They won't influence me. I'm strong. I got a strong faith. I'll just hang out with them. I'll be okay. Really? Really? Not a good choice, was it? God also makes a choice in this story. At the very end, verses 14 to 18, God comes back to Abraham, and he basically says to Abraham, you have chosen well. And because you've come back to, and this shows you the grace of God, by the way, and the forgiveness of God, doesn't it? Abraham, after messing everything up, comes home. He decides to come back to the land, back to his altar and his relationship with God, back to where God would have him to be, living the way God would have him to live, being unselfish and generous in all that he does, a man of integrity, a man of godliness, a man of decency. And God says, guess what? I'm going to honor you. I'm going to bless you. I know you chose the sorry part of the land, but let me tell you, you can have that whole sorry land, every square inch of it, and you're going to have more land than you ever thought, and you're going to have more flocks and herds than you thought you could ever have, and you're going to have children, and you're going to have a family, and you're going to have a nation named after you. And I promise you, as I promised you before you left me, and after you've come back, I'm just saying it again, all the nations of the world are going to be blessed through your seed. You know, the Bible says if we confess our sins to one another, he is faithful and just to forgive us. He will take you back in a heartbeat and not even ask questions. You come back to your altar. You open up your sacrifice relationship with God again, and he'll take you home. When that prodigal son came home, his father didn't look at him and say, okay, where have you been? Who have you been with? Go ahead, you might as well get it out. Tell me everything you did. Do I have any grandchildren I need to know about anywhere? Are there any fines we need to pay? Are there any warrants out for your arrest? Somebody going to come knock on the door? He didn't ask any of those questions. He just said, let's have a feast. This my son was dead and is alive. He was lost and now he's found. Let's celebrate. That's God. And that's grace. Now, let me give you a couple of thoughts. You can go home. Always remember that your decisions have consequences. The ones you make this morning will have consequences. Every decision you make will have some consequence. Now, in many cases, decisions we make are relatively non-consequential. You know, whether I wear blue pants or khakis tomorrow to school is not probably going to shake the world or change anything greatly. You know? Fairly inconsequential. But Other consequences can be pretty far-reaching. And we all know what I'm talking about because we've all experienced those. Some of us are living through those right now, and that's okay. You know, part of life is God never promises to insulate us from the consequences of our choices. God never says, make a bad choice and I'll make sure nothing bad happens to you. That's not what God promises. In fact, sometimes God will let the whole thing play out with the understanding that all things work together for good. All things work together for good by God's definition over time when the final chapter is written. But until then, you may have to wade through some muck. You may have to put some hip waders on. It may get that bad, and that's just okay. I mean, we can't do anything about that. All of our decisions have consequences. This is my suggestion, though. When you go through your decision process about anything, what am I going to do for a job? Where am I going to live? Where am I going to go to school? Am I going to go to school? Who am I going to marry? Are we going to have children? How are we going to raise our kids? How am I going to treat my customers? How am I going to deal with my neighbors? Am I going to go to church or not? Am I going to be involved? I would suggest that you never forget. If you always remember that decisions have consequences, never forget to include God's will in that process. James has a very interesting statement at the end of the book of James. He says, woe to you who say to yourselves, we will go to this town or that town and spend this amount of time or that amount of time and do this or that, when in fact you ought to be saying, if God wills, we will do those things. What is James saying? He's not just talking about planning a business trip. He's talking about making your decisions in life, whatever they are. If God wills. Sometimes, you know something? God already tells you what his will is. Then you just got to decide, am I going to go with the man or not? Abraham found out real quick when you don't, it turns out ugly. Now, to me, this story is a very common sense story. Because you got a man that has made bad choices, but now decides to change that process and start making good choices. And can you redeem the time? Can you redeem the situation? Yes, you can. God will always rise with you above that. On the other hand, you got another person who's always kind of not had to make choices, and now the first choice he makes is the worst choice of his life. And his whole life ends up devastated by it on more than one occasion. In the next chapter, Lot's life is put at risk. A couple of chapters after that, he risked the destruction of his family and the rape of his daughters. After that, he loses his wife. When he gets off by himself, hiding in the caves with his daughters practice grossly immoral things with him, which means he hasn't lost his daughters physically, but he's lost his daughters. They've bought into the immorality of the world they were raised in. And you know, that story just doesn't end well. Just doesn't end well. And try though he may to be a good guy, he just can't overcome the consequences of his decisions. I don't know if you've ever made a decision for Christ. If you've ever decided, I'm going to be a Christian. We have a lot of folks that have done that recently, and God bless you for it. But I'm going to tell you, those of you that are new in the faith, you're surrounded by a family of people who've many times made those decisions years ago and are still making that decision every single day. They get up every morning saying, I'm a child of God, I'm saved by grace, I walk by faith. And it's not going to change. If you're not a Christian, we encourage you to come this morning, confess your faith in Jesus, be baptized into Christ. If you're a Christian and you need encouragement, let us know. Families are here for that. You know, when you have a need, you go to your family and you say to them, listen, I'm in a tight spot here, can you help me out? And usually the family will come through because that's what families do. They take care of each other, and we'll do that too. If you need to respond in any way, we love you enough that we encourage you.